We're going to do that, and we're going to talk about that more on the 15th as well. But we're going to talk about loving where you live. That's what this is about here today. I don't know about you, but excuse my voice there. I went for water, and they had coffee. So, of course, I got coffee. That didn't really help, though. But just about a year after the pandemic began, we decided to put up a fence. We had a lot of reasons. We had a couple dogs, and we needed them to be able to go outside and not have to watch them, right? So that was a really good reason. One of the other reasons is it was kind of a domino effect. We watched some other neighbors kind of put their fences in. We thought, oh, that looks good. I like that. I like that. Then we saw the price, and we said, I don't like that. And then we decided to do it anyway. So we decided about a year in, about April of 21, we put in our fence, and our neighbor beside us, talking about the domino effect, they said, hey, we want in on this, but we can only pay for the part that's going to separate us. Now, mind you, we have wonderful neighbors. We love the neighbors to our left that we were talking with about this, but we split the 6-foot privacy fence. They wanted a privacy fence because they wanted to put a hot tub in. I don't blame them, you just don't want people looking at you when you're in the hot tub, right? So they put this thing in, but it was great, and we learned a couple things. Thank you. Wow. That's nice, isn't it? Okay. We put this thing in, and it reminded us of a couple things. One was we're really interconnected with people that maybe we don't even altogether know very well. Interdependent even sometimes. Because sometimes when you put in a new fence and you have an adjoining portion of that fence, then they are compelled to replace their fence because now they have one section that's new and the rest of it looks terrible, right? Ever been a part of that? So like you do it and then somebody else does and somebody else does it. We get interconnected that way at times. And the other thing we noticed is that the neighborhood looked very different with the fences down and then with the fence up. And we began to have some unintended consequences that came with that. And it wasn't that we wanted separation or that our neighbors wanted separation, but what we found happened in the middle of the pandemic is that we began to speak less. It kind of crossed through our homes, so it wasn't like we just stood on the sides of our houses and spoke, but it just kind of symbolized something that happened unintentionally. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? Some people put fences up for that reason specifically, right? Or a wall in the back, like you fortify your backyard because of all and the balls still come in, right? The balls and dogs jumping in. One time we looked out. And we thought we had this wonderful barrier of a fence. 2 houses down, we had some really fun neighbors, and they have 3 bulldogs. One of them name is Meatball. That's a good name for a bulldog. And it came running down, and all of a sudden our dog was meeting it at the fence, and I mean that. But if you go out there, that thing just lick you to death. Have you ever been licked by a bulldog? It is kind of overwhelming. Let's just put it that way. So anyway, there are a number of reasons why we do fences, but this became kind of a picture of what happened in the entire ordeal, and I want to talk to you today about some of that. About 10 months ago, we moved here into the RV about a couple months ago, but 8 months before that. Coming out of the pandemic, we began to have a shift with one of our neighbors. Now, I had 2 neighbors right in front of me. One's name was John. His wife's name was Valerie. And over here, I just knew it was just John. Okay, there were a few other people in the house, his daughter and her boyfriend and some other people, but it was John and John. One day I get a call from Holly, and John on the left, he had a heart attack, and he just died, like right then in that moment. He never even left his house. They tried to resuscitate him, and he passed away. And before that happened, the other John, who I didn't really have as good of a relationship with, this John, he was cool. He was like grandpa to everybody. He'd keep his garage open and have the screen doors on the garages. I think that's just a completely unique thing to Florida, right? But inside, you'd hear him playing what sounded like a banjo or something like that. He made guitars out of boxes. He was the strangest, coolest guy all at the same time. I go over there and he'd show me his new box guitar. I was like, okay, cool. He made little miniature places. He would do replicas of things, train depots and things like that. He was just you felt like you were going to Grandpa's basement every time you went and saw John. And he was a great guy. We talked about our yards all the time, and he was a good neighbor. Well, one of these days I noticed that the other John beside him was mowing his grass for him. And Valerie, especially after John had passed away, really appreciated it. But I noticed that Other John, I feel like that's what I have to call him. Other John, his mower wasn't working that well. And I just said, hey, listen, man, I really appreciate what you're doing to love on them. Let me lend you my lawnmower anytime. Just let me know, and I'll put it out if I'm not going to be here, and just whatever you need. And so we kind of got, I lent him my lawnmower. He goes, hey, what do you need? I said, well, I hate my blower. So he'd lend me his really high-powered blower. It was, we had a good thing going there, and we really began to get to know each other. His dad would come down. He was a retired Lutheran pastor. I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. I noticed that when I come back to my iPad and it's dark, I've probably been talking too long away from it. But when John died, I got to know the other John, and it was really unfortunate when we decided to leave. That was one of the hard parts, was that we left someone who we were really getting to know and figure out how to be kind to one another and how to get to know one another, even though some of the things we were getting to know, we didn't have like-mindedness in all of those things. And John, he still is a good guy, and we went over and saw the house and some of our neighbors, and they begged us to come back. That was sweet. That was nice. We had another neighbor down the street. Her name is Celeste, and Celeste was, we met her as we walked by her house. She was always in her garage, and it looked like, we thought, okay, maybe she's, a little off. She looked like she was talking to herself all the time. It was the weirdest thing. Then we found out she was TikToking. It was great. We were like, you really? She's like, yeah, I got like 10,000 followers. I'm like, what in the world? Like, this is so weird. So we have our TikToking friend and our lawn mowing friend and our, box guitar making friend. We had lots of neighbors that ended up being really good friends. She would come over and borrow the sewing machine and take it back, and she'd bring back the sewing machine with food, and it was just wonderful. We loved our neighbors. It was good. Now, again, to clarify, kind neighbors, but the rest of them, it seemed like we would, you wave at them when you saw them, right? You guys know what I'm talking about. Most of us know our neighbors, but not really well. You know them enough to wave at them, participate in the kids', cookie fundraisers, and, but we all lead busy lives, and that's pretty much as far as that relationship tends to go. We're going to talk about something for a couple weeks that is always important, always, but it seems especially significant during this unique season of continued concern over illness and pandemic stuff. And then economic uncertainty is really big too. And so we got some major issues that precipitate from those two things, but really begin to wear on people and continue to be there. So would you do me a favor? Open your Bibles, whether that's on your phone and your app or in your hand there. There's chairback Bibles in front of you. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22 is a really wonderful passage where Jesus begins to talk to us about what it looks like to love where we live. And so we want to go there together. Again, the name of this series the next few weeks is Love Where You Live, because it's really the most basic, perhaps the most impactful way to demonstrate the love of Jesus to others. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but in the pandemic, it restricted us and limited us in travel. I was about to go see Josh when he was in South Africa, and he was coming back to be on staff, and before that we were going to take a couple weeks together in South Africa, and just like that in March, boom, it was gone in 2020. But here's the thing. Every mission field that we could go to, we couldn't go to except for one, and that was the one that we tend to overlook the most. That's the ones that are right where we live. And Jesus speaks into this. I know probably some of you are thinking, I thought we were going to get into a book study, and where's the deep theological, profound, stuff? How about we start with what Jesus declared as one of the most important things? He called it the second greatest commandment. Can we start there? Is that okay? And I promise we'll get into a book study soon. I'm proposing, though, that we genuinely discover what it means to be a good neighbor. That's our reminder. That's our challenge here in the next few weeks. It doesn't matter what your background is. You can benefit from this concept, and you can practice being a better neighbor, even if you're a good one, as we think about this. Let's read Matthew chapter 22, verse 34. It's entitled The Greatest Commandment. It says this: hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. So the teachers are like, hey, let's take our shot. And one of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. You guys heard this, right? He's hearkening back to Deuteronomy 6 and the Shema. This is the first and greatest commandment, the first and the greatest. Let me summarize all of it just like this, he says. And the second is like it. It's not the same, but it's really close. It could be like a 1B. It's one of those that you say, okay, this could be almost the litmus test for my life to see if 1A is actually working and is stuck, right? If I can do 1B, then I know 1A is going well in my life. Does that make sense? He says the second one is like it, and I think he's even saying of equal importance. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets, all of it, all the stuff that came before Jesus hangs on these two commandments. We utilize the clip hangers in our RV because it's space saving for us. Instead of having them folded on a hanger, you hang them straight down and it works. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. You can clip everything in your life, all of the things that define for you what's right and wrong, all of the practical ways that you love anyone around you depends on these two things. Everything emanates from that. And so we want to talk about this. A little review for some here, but it's an important one. We've been given really two powerful commands as Christians. The first one that we are not paying attention to today, but is wonderful, the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And Jesus says, I will be with you as you do this. Until I return, until the end of the age, I will be with you as you go about this. Wonderful, great, one of the most powerful commandments in the Bible. And the second one is the one we're looking at. Love God and love people. Every person can help bring neighbors closer to God by understanding a couple biblical principles of neighboring. You didn't know those were in there, right? Well, we're going to take a couple things and help understand from this passage what those principles of neighboring are. This is how we love our neighbor. Number one, it's the proximity principle. Proximity. This is really important because if we're having a conversation later on in the lobby and you might say to me, Pastor, I am called to love my neighbor. I know that, but I think my neighbor, in quotations, I think of them as my coworkers and my kids' classmates and their families from school, our church family, not necessarily the people who happen to live next door. I'm not sure I like them anyway, right? But if you use the word in Matthew 22 or in Luke 10, which is another parallel passage, for the word for neighbor is very telling. It's this word called plesion. And plesion is a root word for this idea of being near to. So this idea of proximity is very important when it comes to what it means to have a neighbor. Now, it does include all these other people, and that's a good broad definition, but if we left out the ones who are nearest to us, we might have a little bit of a problem, right? There might be a gap. So we don't want that to be there. In other words, he's saying a neighbor is someone close by you. It's not just someone that you met from school or at church. I'm glad you consider them neighbors. But he's talking about the big idea of this word is that neighbor means your actual neighbors. We want to start there at the very least, right? God has sovereignly, listen to this, God has sovereignly placed you among your neighbors. Now, Wesleyans have a hard time with sovereignty sometimes, okay? But God has placed you specifically where you live right now. And there's a reason for that. Remember in Luke's account of the same conversation, one of the people listening asked Jesus to specify who qualified as a neighbor. Okay, then who is my neighbor then? How can I know specifically what this looks like? And Jesus' response is one of the coolest and greatest parables that we've ever heard, and that is the Good Samaritan, right? Well known even outside of Christian circles. The Good Samaritan is Jesus' answer to who is my neighbor. And central to the idea of this parable is that people were trying to get around caring for neighbors. Why? How? The people near to you, by redefining who their neighbor was. That never happens today, does it? We never redefine anything, do we? And they were doing it by focusing on current agendas and networks rather than dealing with what was right in front of them. And Jesus was trying to tell them in this parable to help get them to this truth that your neighbor is the person right next to you. And if there is someone in need in front of you, that's your neighbor. You help them. You don't go out of your way to avoid them. You don't try to redefine who your neighbor is so you don't have to help them. Even if there was no previous relationship, that person in front of you in need is your neighbor, in other words. So the heart of the answer is this: there is no one, absolutely no one, no matter how different from you they are, who exempts you from the call to love your neighbor. Especially your neighbor nearest to you who you don't like, who doesn't look like you, talk like you, listen to the same music you do, doesn't vote like you, doesn't wear a mask like you or vax like you. I don't care what it is. The idea is this: no one, no matter how different from you they are, exempts you from your call to love the nearest to you. And so this is what we want to look at. God has sovereignly placed you. Obviously, Jesus had in mind for us to love more people than just those who live next door to us. We know that. But wouldn't it at least include those next door to us? And so if it does, here's what we need to understand. The people around you were placed near you for a reason. Do you ever think about your neighbors that way? That God may have put you into a place, ergo having them be next to you for a reason? They actually may need to know Jesus. God may actually want to use you to show kindness and do something different than anyone else is doing around them and bring them to Christ. We've made neighboring less than it really is. It means God has placed you next to people to love them. That's what he specifically says is the action. Love them. I fear that out of a desire to make everyone our neighbors, we may have gone and made no one our neighbors because we don't want to be bothered, or we don't want to step out of a comfort zone of ours and talk to someone. We don't want to get rejected. Whatever the reason may be, it's just too messy. It's just harder to speak to that person than to give them space and to respect them. Oh man, we love to respect people, don't we, today? As long as they're over there. But when they're your neighbor, you don't have a choice. You know what I'm saying, right? Some of your neighbors you can't avoid. You just can't. They're either playing music till 3 or 4 in the morning, or you always somehow, even if you try to avoid it, you always get home at the same time as them, right? And it's like the race is like who can get in their garage fastest, shut the door. The truth is, you can see everyone as your neighbor and love them and honor God through it. That's true. But doesn't it seem especially backward, given what Scripture is saying right here about the importance of your placement, your proximity, that we'd ignore our literal neighbors? That would seem a little backwards if we decided the people next door to me don't qualify for the love that he's telling me to love them with. So it turns out the world, they also see this as a benefit as well. They're discovering that what Jesus said is a really good idea. Just even back in the 60s, we can see this is happening. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, tells a story of a village. The village was in a town called Roseto, Pennsylvania, and it was a town made up of entirely citizens who came from the village of Rosetta Valfortore in Italy. And they always say it more beautiful than that because they're from Italy, right? Intrigued by the extremely low incidence of disease in Roseto, including no coronary artery disease in anyone under the age of 55. That's an outlier, right? So why are they so healthy, especially when it comes to their hearts? And wouldn't you know, they looked at all this medical research for years. They studied them to try to understand what was going on. And they didn't eat any differently than the people around them. So it wasn't their diet that was creating this. The long and the short of it is this. They came to the conclusion that their connections to their neighbors were so profound, it actually helped them to live longer. They were so close to the people around them. They sacrificed, they lived with them, they gave, they received. it actually helped them to live longer, healthier. But this isn't some new discovery. It's actually God's idea. If you look at Acts chapter 17, he goes into this, and I'm going to read it for you. Paul's speaking to the philosophers in Athens. You can follow along on the screen. The God who made the world and everything in it, he is the Lord of heaven and earth. He does not live in shrines made by hands, neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. Verse 26, from one man he has made every nationality. Now look at this as it's underlined. To live over the whole earth, and has determined their appointed times and the boundaries of where they live. He did not do this so that he did this so that they might seek God, and perhaps even they might reach out and find him. Though he is not far from each one of us. So God is not far from us, seeking for us to reach out to him. And he has appointed for us even the boundaries of where we live in our country and in our town. Did you hear that? There is a purpose behind where you live. And it's a part of God's bigger story. It's a part of his plan. And if done right by the church, we recognize who we're near to and who we're supposed to love. And it's been determined and appointed for us to have these boundaries in our lives. He did this that they might seek God. That's important, right? This has all been done on purpose. You were placed in your neighborhood for a reason, and so were your neighbors. So, church today, it has more literature and more media and more programs and training for reaching others than any time in our history, and yet, at least in America, most churches around us are declining. Why? Why? Maybe it could be as simple as that we've forgotten the most foundational part of the process, and that's that Jesus said, start with your neighbors. Maybe. Maybe we've forgotten what that looks like in our lives. I just imagine if God's people caught a vision for the most basic command Jesus gave us, things might become a little different for us. So I want us to look at the verb love. Love your neighbor. That's where the second principle comes from. It's the kindness principle, okay? The kindness principle, what does it mean to love our neighbors? Sometimes we overlook the practical idea of love, and I was just at this wonderful thing called the Gathering for church Wesleyan pastors around our nation and our world, and we all gathered in Orlando together, and one of the keynote speakers was a guy named Albert Tate, and he talked about this very, very eloquently. I cannot pretend, even if I read it, what he said, I still would not do it justice. But he basically said this: love is complete. It's not ambiguous. There are some people out there, you kind of wonder, based on how they look, they could be Asian, they could be, Hispanic, those kind of people. He says love is not like those kinds of people, right? He was giving a distinction. He's not saying they're not loving or lovable, okay? Just hear me when I'm saying that. If they have an ambiguous face and you can't figure out what their nationality is, it doesn't mean they're not lovable. That's not what I'm saying, okay? On the other side, he gave an example of someone who is quite frankly exactly who he is in his nationality, and you'll never question that. He says love is that. And it starts with God. It emanates from who God is. God is love, right? And the creator and sustainer of the universe, he gets to define what love looks like because it is who he is. And out of his character, he defines for us love. And then Paul goes on to tell people in the church of Corinth who are having trouble dealing with one another, this is what you need to know about love. You can have all of these things. You can come to church and you can sing well and you can prophesy and you can do all of these all of these things in the world that everyone thinks a Christian should do. But if you don't have love, you basically don't have anything. And so many of us want to be Spirit-filled, but if we can't go and be kind to our neighbor because love is patient and love is kind, if we can't be kind to our neighbor, then I guess we're actually not Spirit-filled like we thought we were. You can't be Spirit-filled and not be kind. You guys see what I'm saying, right? He's saying it's basically one of those games that we play that if you don't have love, you don't have anything. You can enjoy wonderful services, and you can enjoy coming and crying and having an emotional time with the Lord. But if you walk outside of this building and into your own neighborhood and you can't be kind to the one who's nearest to you, you don't have it. You don't have love, and you don't have anything. It got that quiet for him, by the way, too. All the pastors are like, ugh. And it's so true. Maybe if the command was like this, like your neighbor, like what would you do to express like? Maybe that helps you, but the idea is this, that kindness is kind of the on-ramp to loving them. And we forget this sometimes. Things have become so contentious in our world that we have to take a side. We have to take a side. And anytime you take a side, whether it's in politics or in medicine or here in the church, somebody has to lose, don't they? Because when we take sides, you're taking a side to win, to be right, aren't you? And it's a horrible place to be, especially in the church. It does not breed unity. It breeds disunity. And when you're thinking about how to be a good neighbor to the people nearest to you, don't take sides. Don't make them your enemy from the jump, because you will never be able to be kind to them then. It'll be self-serving at best. Ego stroking if you're kind to someone who's your enemy. Don't go there. Think about that person. That person is worth something to God, and they're worth getting to know because of that. And I'm not going to define them by how they don't think like me and talk like me and vote like me. Here's the bottom line. Have I offended a bunch of people now? God is calling you to invest in your neighbors. Sacrifice for your neighbors when necessary. And ultimately to show kindness, the kindness of God to your neighbor. He is calling you to this. And the second thing is like the first. And if you don't do the second thing well, the first isn't really taking in your life. You got to love God with all you are. And we haven't just brushed over that on purpose. It's just the lack of time. But when you think about the first greatest commandment, God gave his all for us, and we in response, as an opportunity of worship, give our all back to him. Right? That's what it means. We give our all to God. We place our full trust in him. We have a full surrender to God as a result of that. We love God with everything that we are and everything that we do. But the second one is so much like it. It's the litmus test. It's the practice arena, if you will, of loving God, is how you love your neighbor. It's like God said, do you love me? Okay, here's your neighbor. Show me. Show me how much you love me. Because I love them as much as I love you. I sent my son to die for them just as much as I sent him to die for you. Show me how much you love me. Some of you are like, but you don't know my neighbor. I understand that. Somebody came up to me and said, I told him, I was like, hey, when's the last time you called the cops on your neighbor? And she goes, I had to, but let me tell you why. And we had a good conversation about why, and I thought it was kind of funny. I don't think we missed the point, but you know what I mean. But with this in mind, with this idea that we are supposed to invest in our neighbors and sacrifice when necessary, and ultimately let kindness be an on-ramp to loving them and having them experience God's love. With this in mind, I think there's a great irony in the church, and here it is. I think that many Christians tend to skip over or jump over this great commandment to love God and love people in order to get to the Great Commission and make disciples. We've kind of gotten to a place where we basically decided, okay, I can at least approach my neighbor because I'm going to invite them to church. So if it's an invitation, I can do that, and then I'll just let God do the rest, right? But here's the thing. So many times what we get to is we don't want to invest energy to share kindness, but we'll invite them to church, right? You called the cops on them, but you want them to come to church. You know what I'm saying, right? Like, this happens in lots of different ways. We ignore them completely throughout the week until it's like friend day or something, right? And then we go in and we invite them to church because, well, I think that's the Christian thing to do. But here's the deal. We don't want to share kindness, but sometimes we're surprised when the people who are still strangers aren't interested at all in the message of hope that we're asking them to be interested in. Saying, this is for you, but I'm unwilling to share it with you other than an invitation. to come to a place. When Jesus is saying, show me how much you love me by how you love on them. How patient are you with them? How kind are you with them? Are you self-seeking? Are you self-sacrificing? Albert Tate didn't spare a single one of those in asking us how we love our neighbor, as love is defined in 1 Corinthians 13. It was a challenging moment. We have to do both to be effective. We have to go and we have to share the good news, but we have to love as well. So I'm told when it's time to start planting a garden. Any gardeners in here? Okay, so tell me if I'm right, okay? You can do it one of two ways. You can plant seeds, begin to water them, right? Or you can go to the store and you can buy what they call ready-to-go plants, seedlings, right? And you can put those in. It takes far less time, right? The same amount of effort, but far less time, doesn't it? There's really no difference between the two, except when you plant seeds, you have to wait. And that's really the point. In the kingdom of God, there are no seedlings, right? Besides the people who are coming to Florida to live, and they come to your church already a disciple, and you get to be a part of the discipleship process with them, or they're just ready to know Jesus in this move that they're making, which doesn't happen a whole lot, right? They don't just come to church and go, I'm ready to receive Christ right now. Like, I hope that becomes a norm, right? But here's the reality. We don't have seedlings in the kingdom. You have to start with the seed and plant it and trust when you can't see the progress. Or as Jesus put it, this is part of the waiting. You have to have patience to wait. He says, love your neighbor, plant the seed, and see what God does. And here's the thing. If you're looking for an affirming response from him, if you're looking for kindness back in the seed that you're planting, and that becomes the litmus test for whether or not you were successful or not, you're not looking at this thing right. You may get a door slammed in your face. You may get a rejection. You may get the nasty comment that you've always gotten before. And you say in your mind, see, I knew this is how it would end, and you just give up. That is not what we're talking about. Jesus says, plant the seed and trust me. Trust that I'm doing something in their life. Trust that I've planted you where you are. So plant some seeds of kindness and love in their life and see if something doesn't sprout up from that. And I don't mean just meeting your neighbors just so you can make a presentation and invite them to church. Again, we've talked about that. It means getting to know people around us because they're worth getting to know. It means listening as much as talking. It means letting the Holy Spirit do the work in the midst of that relationship. And it means that it takes God's timing. And you have to be willing to wait for that. So how? How do we do this? How are we to love our neighbors? Jesus tells us right here. He says this, love your neighbor as yourself. Hone in on that word, yourself. You have to think about it. How do I love myself? Some of you don't love yourselves very well, okay? That's a whole nother talk, okay? So if you don't love yourself very well, don't love your neighbors like that, okay? But when we think about how we love ourselves, there's something about this. It makes you think of, how do you do this? How much of our activity centers around the care and the comfort of ourselves or our family? And he says, as you think about that, as you think about how you do that, how you care for yourself, how you make time for those kinds of things, he says, then you should imagine what it would be like if you showered that love on your neighbors, the ones nearest to you. Take what you do for yourself and do it for others. And he says, do it. He says, love your neighbors. Folks, I love that fellowship is so intentional about meeting the deepest needs of people all over the world. I think we have a wonderful vision for how we help and aid and partner with missionaries across the world and how we partner with people in Cuba, and we do all of these wonderful things, right? I even love how we compassionately and generously love people through the Dollar Club. It's a wonderful way to find someone in need around you, but you have to first have compassion for them, right? You have to have some empathy and understand where they're at, and then you have to nominate them to receive a gift. If you can't show kindness to someone, you're not going to have any compassion for them. right? You're not going to see them the way God sees them. And so we could have all the intentional, meeting deepest needs all around us, but we can't call ourselves missional if we simultaneously neglect being kind to those nearest to us. It's not like you're getting a gold star for all the global missions, right? And the community outreach that the church gets to do because you give or you nominated. And then turn around and just be a jerk to your neighbor. It doesn't work that way. People all around you matter immensely to God. Have you ever thought about how these two commands are connected, to love God and love people? Think about this. If you look closely at the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus is the role of the Samaritan. Think about how a stranger who had no obligation whatsoever to help someone who could have been considered an enemy. The Bible tells us that we're enemies of God because of our sin, right? So you could be considered an enemy. I don't care for you because of the sin in your life, and so I'm not going to deal with you. That's how God could have dealt with us. And yet he stepped outside of his own rights. They park their car in front of my mailbox all the time. They're constantly playing music as loud as can be. They don't even care. They ignore my text to turn it down. What right do you try to claim? Because they're your enemy and not someone God wants you to love. He laid down and steps outside of his own rights. He entered into our pain and he gave his own life for us. That's the gospel, right? Some of us need to begin right there. This is an ouch sermon. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. You guys are very quiet, by the way. You see, when we say people matter immensely to God, we're actually saying you matter immensely to God. Jesus died for you. And I wonder if there's somebody here today, even after hearing a sermon like this, who would say, I want to give my life to Jesus. And if you do, we have pastors all over, Pastor Josh and Joe, myself, or someone you trust who would love to speak to you about that. But for the rest of us, for all of us, actually, I wonder whether we're ready to get intentional about this command to love our neighbors. This is the challenge. This is the reminder. This is what it means to live distinct and attractive in a world that needs to see something different. And they need to see something different. And it needs to come from inside here. Like Pastor Joe said, when we experience and think and remind ourselves about how much God loves us, that can't help but begin to come out of us. And how does it look? It means loving your neighbor as yourself. That's what it looks like. It means showing kindness and patience and not being self-seeking to the ones nearest to you, and that includes the ones who live right next door. So you can love where you live and show how much you love God at the very same time. Are you willing to be intentional about that? I want to encourage you to join me in the next few weeks in this opportunity. It's a really creative title. Okay, we're going to go to this. It's called the Love Your Neighbor Challenge. I knew you'd think it was creative, okay? Love Your Neighbor Challenge. And here's the first thing I want you to do. Reach out to your neighbors and connect with them. I don't care how you do it. I'm about to show you a video that shows how this is done, and it's just an example of that. But show kindness to your neighbor by just getting to know them. There's something really different between hey bro and hey Joe, right? When you know their name, and all of us do it, right? I'm sorry. I become way less prideful about this. When I don't know your name, I'm going to ask you, okay? Because nobody wants to hear bro, right? Like, hey, guy, good to see you here at church. Like, he doesn't know my name, does he? No, that doesn't, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to ask you your name if I can't remember it. But there's a big difference with your neighbor. It's going to make a big impact if you know their name, and then you call them by their name. It's a place to start. Get connected with your neighbors. Reach out to them. And can I tell you this? I don't think people say this might be the hardest time. I think this is the best time. When you think about how barriers have come back up, fences have come back up because of politics or whatever it is, right? And we begin to live again divided amongst each other. simultaneously not liking everyone else around us that doesn't think like us. When we think about that, I actually think this is the best opportunity. In this moment, if you show just a little bit of kindness, that would have an immense impact in this moment. So reach out to your neighbor and get connected. And I also want you to pray for them. I want you to take a step out to them, and then I want you to come back to your home and pray for them. And we have a prayer guide. The link is in your handout, or it's at the welcome desk. Just forgive me, Wesleyans. It's from a Baptist church, okay? It's a Baptist church who did this. It's really cool. It's called empoweredhome.org that made it, and it's really cool. This is it. I want you to pray for them, and this is a guide to literally guide you through a week's worth of praying for your neighbors around you as you reach out and get connected to them. That's it. Can you do that with me? No? Okay, that's bad. Can you do that with me? Yes. Awesome. Here's an example that was captured of one lady who made the decision to love where she lived.
I guess you could say that my family and my husband and I are homebodies. We don't do a whole lot. We go to work, come home, have dinner, get ready for school, get ready for work the next day, go to bed and do it all over again. We kind of just stick to ourselves. Hola, ¿cómo estás? Good. Ven. How was school, baby? Good. Well, some people can say we don't have a lot of people in our circle. We just don't really even have a circle. It's just kind of our family. We've been living here for 2 months now. My husband's name is Omar. We've been married for 6 years. We have a daughter. Her name's Mercedes. I don't know a whole lot about the neighborhood. We don't know anybody that lives around us. We haven't introduced ourselves. We've seen the neighbors. I can tell you, I know that there's 3 other families that live in the same fourplex. But apart from that, I don't know any of my neighbors. One of the reasons is fear of rejection. It is awkward, stepping out of your comfort zone. You're not sure how people are going to react. At my church recently, we've been talking about how God wants us to love our neighbor, and I've been thinking about that. I've been praying about it. In prayer, I found peace and some comfort. I think it's a step of faith, on my part to let myself grow. Just go out and do it. So our homeowners association sent out a newsletter that we're having a community garage sale. Good morning. So we decided to make some breakfast tacos and hand them out. Give them a taco, introduce ourselves, let them know who we are, how long we've lived here, and see if maybe we can establish or build a relationship with them. I am surprised that I'm not nervous because it's not something that I would see myself doing that I thought I wanted to do or that I would want to do, and I'm doing it. I wouldn't have done this a year ago. Without a doubt, I wouldn't have done it. Hi, good morning.
Omar, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you,
Yeah.
Tanya.
We're
Is this your
taking
garage
out-
sale?
Yeah.
Y'all have got quite a bit of stuff. Wow.
Oh, yeah. We're still taking it out.
Okay. Well, we wanted to come by and introduce ourselves. Take advantage of the community garage sale, and we wanted to bring you guys some breakfast tacos.
Oh my goodness,
Okay.
look at you. Did you
Yeah.
make these?
I did. They're
what
still
kind?
they're still warm. I didn't label them, but
What kind of them?
I think it's important for us to love our neighbors because that's what God's created us to do. It pleases God.
Maricela, did you meet them? They live down the road.
Hi, Maricela.
Yeah.
Tanya Álvarez. Nice to meet you. Igualmente. Gracias.
Yeah.
If you make friendships or relationships, build relationships, trust comes in, love comes in. And only God knows what will develop and how far, it will flourish. I mean, we could potentially be making lifelong friends. Bye. It was nice meeting you guys. Bye, Marisela. Bye. It wasn't scary. It was nice. It was easier than it was initially. How I was going to approach them, what was I going to say, it just came naturally. Initially it was scary. Now it's becoming more natural and normal.
Can be pretty easy, huh? Listen, if my wife said, we're going to make breakfast tacos, I would have ate all the bacon before she could get it done. I don't know about you. I can't make very good breakfast tacos. I can eat bacon really well. But here's the thing. I can love where I live. And I don't know about you. I don't know if you guys know this, but I have a new neighbor. And he's hard to love, guys. He's not here, so that was fun. All right, sorry. It's Pastor Josh. He moved in beside me. I'm sorry. We got a weird setup here now. I don't know if you know if you were left and gone, and we all live in RVs now. But no, there's some neighbors around me, and I have a plan to talk. I know one of our neighbors comes over here and hits golf balls around because it's a nice place. We're gonna have some chipping time together. I think we're gonna try to do that. But however you can do it, find a way to show kindness and get connected. That's the challenge. Would you stand with us today? Another way that you could do this maybe is that as the pandemic went on, we were starving for connections, weren't we? We do just about anything. We'd all meet with our friends at a parking lot just to see each other, and we'd park in a circle together, and we would talk, right? That kind of thing. You'd go outside just to see a neighbor and say hello. You were willing to do it then, but now that we've kind of stepped back out into our freedom again, we've kind of put the barriers back up. So here's maybe another way to think about it. All the chairs that you use in the lanai or in the backyard where you're safe and you're secluded, why don't you move those out front and sit in your front yard? Don't get a nasty letter from the HOA, okay? But do it in a way that, lets you be able to be visibly seen by your neighbors and see if God doesn't do something with that. Just make yourself present. Some of you are like freaking out right now. You're like, I just cannot do this. There's no way. But see if God can't use something as you connect. All right? Remember, you can